when we think about the return on the investment in a marketing expenditure, whether it's advertising or something a bit broader than that in terms of communication strategy, we can think about social media. And social media is something that has been debated extensively, pretty much ever since Facebook let brands post things on Facebook, which is quite some time ago now. There's sort of always been this debate about, what's the ROI of a like, things like that. My perspective on that is a little bit different, because you need to see how social media and what you're doing with your brand or your company in social media, you gotta think about how that fits into the bigger picture of what you're doing with marketing. So yes, you want to spend money on, say, placing an ad on Facebook or placing an ad on some website or in a magazine or a newspaper or a TV or whatever it might be. You want to think about the effectiveness of that relative to the cost it was. And so typically you tend to get pretty good returns, relatively speaking, to something on social media, for instance, if your goal is to get interactivity, if your goal is to get people to engage, to share, to do those sorts of things that you can't do with something that is in a sort of a one-to-many medium like TV, for example. Now, TV, though, can give you massive reach, but you got to pay for that reach. And so it's really an industry debate at the moment. I think you can sort of try and compare apples to apples if you're looking at the same effectiveness outcome. So if it's just about reach, then you can look at how much you spent to get that many people to potentially see the ad. But if you're thinking about other forms of engagement, like sharing, word of mouth, clicking through to a website and buying something, just liking something, which is sort of a form of social endorsement, then you're not going to get that in traditional channels. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So you have to be careful with that. I think what organizations like Facebook would say is that they have a really large audience every day of the week. And so actually Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, said at an industry conference about a year ago that every day Facebook has, just for people on a mobile device, for instance, Super Bowl-sized audiences, meaning, hundreds of millions of people, that kind of thing. Whereas on TV, say in the United States, you get that once a year, or, only every so often with these typically massive sporting events that are broadcast live. So I think the social media industry is trying to say, hey, you can reach lots of people whenever you want. You don't just have to wait for it the way you would traditional media. But I think from the cost standpoint, the cost of reaching someone typically is low on social media compared to, say, TV, radio, print, and so on. But that's not necessarily factoring into the cost of producing that content. So when you sort of try and look at the total package, I think the smarter thing to do is say, well, we've got a campaign that we're running, and it's across a bunch of different media, not just social. And let's look at the effectiveness overall on a variety of metrics that link to our business goals, as opposed to trying to nut it out at a very, very micro level. So I think the rise of social media has gotten marketers thinking about how they can innovate across a whole host of forms of advertising and communications. So I think if you think about what social media got that, say, TV doesn't have, is this interactivity. So I think we see ads that are more conversational, maybe more thought-provoking. Like if you think about posting something, say, on Instagram as a brand, and you want to get a conversation started, there's a certain style that you might then use, or you might actually have, text in that image that asks a question, or some call to action. I think we see that now, that style, also in other forms of advertising, because they realize that there's a way to prompt conversations. Sure, you can have that dialogue back and forth with customers in social, and you can see it happening, but you could do that with traditional media as well. You're just not going to see the answers. But getting people talking about your brand is probably a good thing. Talking favorably about your brand is probably a good thing. So I think there's this sort of notion of taking some of those elements of social, which are really about conversations, and prompting conversations, and putting them into sort of non-social formats. So I think we're seeing that I think the other thing that we see in sort of how these things, sort of how social's influencing traditional, is actually sort of a bigger picture aspect in terms of making sure all of it fits together. So I think when you think about your media mix, for instance, as a marketer or a media planner or a media buyer or strategist, you're thinking about how not these channels in silos anymore. You're thinking about how they can operate together, sort of synergistically, really, to support each other. So maybe you run a TV ad that is thought-provoking, or maybe even a little bit edgy, controversial, and that drives people to go and talk about it on social media. Or you have a billboard even that is, again, maybe thought-provoking or controversial, and people start taking photos of it, and they pop that on Instagram, and then you get people sharing that and talking about it. So there's these cross-media channel relationships that we've always encouraged people taking advantage of. I mean, back in the day, it used to be called integrated marketing communications. But now there's just more touch points and more channels that you can add to that integrated mix. But this sort of spillover from one to the other, I think, is extremely effective if you can make that happen. And it can go from traditional to social from traditional, both ways, back and forth over time. But it's part of the planning now.